The flight attendant leaned over, seat 2. A looked down at the tired man in the wrinkled jacket holding his sleeping little girl and said loud enough for the whole first-class cabin to hear, "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to the back. This cabin is for our premium passengers." What she did not know, what not one person on that entire aircraft knew, was that the quiet man she was trying to move owned the airline. His name was Julian Ford. He was a single father, and in about 15 minutes the captain of that aircraft was going to come out of the cockpit, take one look at the man in seat 2A and go pale, and everyone who had watched a father get humiliated was going to understand all at once exactly what they had just witnessed. But this is not a story about a rich man teaching a mean stranger a lesson. It's about a little girl asleep on her father's chest at 35,000 feet, and about what a good man decides to do with his power. In the one moment, it would be so easy to do the wrong thing. So stay with me all the way to the end. The last few minutes are what this whole story is really for. And if you believe that the true test of a person is how they treat someone they think can't do anything for them, type the word altitude in the comments right now, and let's begin. Julian Ford was 49 years old, and he had built one of the most respected airlines in the country from a single leased plane and a mountain of debt. But that morning, you'd never have guessed it. He was flying on one of his own aircraft under his own name. No special treatment, no announcement, because that was how Julian did things. He wore a plain gray jacket that had seen better days, khakis, and comfortable shoes, and he carried a scuffed leather bag that was older than most of his employees. And asleep against his chest in the window seat beside him was the reason for the whole trip, his daughter Amara, 6 years old, who had been up since 4 in the morning and had finally drifted off somewhere over the plains. Her small hand curled into the front of his jacket. Julian had not always owned an airline. He had started as a baggage handler. That was the part almost nobody knew, that the founder and chief executive of Ford Air had at 19 years old loaded suitcases onto planes in the freezing cold and the blistering heat for $8 an hour, and had done it for 3 years, and had watched from the tarmac the passengers up in their warm cabins, who never once looked down at the people making their travel possible. He'd worked his way up from their ramp agent, then operations, then a night school degree, earned one exhausted class at a time, then a job in scheduling, then management, and finally, after 2 decades and more risk than most people take in a lifetime, his own airline. But I want you to really see those years on the tarmac, because they made him. Picture a 19-year-old in the dark before dawn out on the ramp in January with the wind coming off the runway hard enough to make your bones ache, hauling suitcase after suitcase up the belt loader while the de-icing trucks hissed in the fog. Picture him looking up just once at the lit windows of the cabin above him, at the passengers settling into their warm seats sipping their drinks. Not one of them aware that a young man was standing in the cold 20 feet below them, making their whole journey possible. Most of them never thought about the ramp crew at all. Why would they? But every so often one of them would glance down and meet his eyes through the window and look away fast, embarrassed, as if they'd accidentally made eye contact with a piece of the machinery. And Julian, 19, freezing, would think, I'm a person up here. I have a whole life. I have dreams you couldn't guess at, and you'll never know because to you, I'm just part of the airport. He wasn't bitter about it. He was too busy for bitter. But he filed it away every single time, and he made himself a promise out there on the frozen tarmac: if I ever get to build something, no one who works for me is ever going to feel the way I feel right now. No one. And decades later, when he finally built it, that promise was the foundation the whole company stood on, not a slogan a consultant wrote, a vow a cold 19-year-old made to himself in the dark, looking up at windows full of people who couldn't see him. But Julian Ford never forgot the tarmac. He never forgot the $8 an hour. He never forgot what it felt like to be one of the invisible people who kept the whole machine running while the important passengers looked straight through them. And he built his entire company on a single rule that he repeated so often his executives could recite it in their sleep. There is no such thing as an unimportant person on my airline. Not one. He believed it all the way down, which is why a few times a year he flew his own airline anonymously in plain clothes in whatever seat came up, not to catch his people being bad, but to feel as a regular passenger, whether the culture he'd built was real or just words on a poster in the break room. That morning he was in seat 2, a first class, because that was the seat the system had assigned him, and he was flying home from a memorial for an old friend with his daughter. Both of them worn thin, both of them just wanting to get home. Now I have to tell you about Amara because she's the heart of this, and because you need to understand what Julian was carrying that morning that had nothing to do with the airline. Julian's wife Amara's mother was named Sophia, and she had died 2 years earlier. Cancer. The slow, cruel kind that gives you just enough time to say goodbye and not nearly enough to be ready. And Julian Ford, who commanded 10,000 employees and a fleet of aircraft, had sat by a hospital bed for 11 months and been completely powerless. And when it was over, he was a widower with a 4-year-old and a company that suddenly meant almost nothing to him. People expected him to disappear into his work. He did the opposite. He handed the day-to-day to people he trusted, and he built his life around his daughter, because he had learned in the worst possible way that the only thing that is actually yours in this world is the time you spend with the people you love, and everything else is just noise. He did school drop-off. He learned to do Amara's hair badly, and then over 2 years less badly. He read the same 3 bedtime stories 900 times, and he flew with her everywhere he could because Sophia had loved to travel, and Julian had decided that his daughter was going to grow up seeing the world the way her mother would have wanted. And here is something you should know about the trip they were on because it matters. They were flying home from a memorial. An old friend of Julian's, a man named Walt, who had given him his very first job on the ramp 30 years earlier, the foreman who'd looked at a skinny 19-year-old with nothing and said, "You show up on time and you work hard, son, and I don't care where you came from." Walt had been the first person in Julian's adult life to treat him like he mattered, and Julian had never forgotten it, and he had flown across the country with his daughter to stand at that man's grave and say thank you. So on the morning this story takes place, Julian Ford was not thinking about being a chief executive. He was raw with grief and gratitude, thinking about a foreman who'd been kind to a nobody, thinking about how one person's decency at the right moment can redirect an entire life. He had in fact told Amara that very morning in the hotel, "We're going home to remember a man who was kind to Daddy when Daddy was nobody. That's the most important kind of person there is, baby. The kind who's nice to you when you're nobody." He had said those exact words to his daughter 3 hours before a flight attendant leaned over her sleeping body and demonstrated the precise opposite. Life has a terrible, perfect sense of timing sometimes. That was the man in seat 2A. That was the tired father with the sleeping girl in the wrinkled jacket when the flight attendant leaned over him and told him he didn't belong. Her name was Brooke, and she was new, 6 weeks on the job, and she had gotten it into her head somewhere in her short career that first class was a stage on which she performed for the important people, and that policing it against anyone who looked like they didn't belong was part of the show. She wasn't a cruel person, not down at the root of her. She was young and insecure and desperate to be seen as belonging in the glamorous world she'd just stepped into, and she had made the oldest mistake there is. She had decided that the way to feel big was to make someone else feel small. She had watched the polished business travelers board and had wanted badly for them to see her as one of their kind. And here was this rumpled man in a worn jacket with a sleeping child, and something in her had whispered, "Here's your chance to show everyone whose side you're on." It was a small, human, ugly impulse, and most of us have felt some version of it. And the only difference is that most of us don't get to act it out at 35,000 feet in front of the person who owns the plane. She had been eyeing Julian since boarding the plane jacket, the old bag, the fact that he clearly wasn't one of the polished business travelers, and she had convinced herself he'd somehow ended up in the wrong seat. And rather than quietly check the manifest, she decided to make a performance of it. "Sir," she said loud, leaning in over the sleeping child. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass. This is the premium cabin." Julian, careful not to wake Amara, quietly reached into his jacket and produced his pass and held it up. Brooke barely glanced at it. "This cabin is for our premium passengers," she repeated as though he hadn't just shown her he was one. "I really think you'd be more comfortable in the back. We can find you and your—" She gestured vaguely at Amara, at the sleeping child, as though she were a piece of luggage. "Your daughter a seat in economy. Let's not make this difficult." The cabin had gone quiet. A businessman across the aisle looked up, frowning uncomfortable. An older woman 2 rows back opened her mouth and then closed it. Because that's what usually happens. People see the cruelty and they feel it's wrong. And they say nothing because it's not their business, because they don't want the scene, because it's easier to look at their phones. And I want to sit in that quiet for a second, because it's the quiet that lets cruelty win. There were maybe 16 people in that first-class cabin, and I'd guess 14 of them knew in their gut that what was happening was wrong. You could see it on their faces, the flicker of discomfort, the wince, the deliberate turning away. Not one of them was a bad person. They were ordinary people, tired, headed home, not looking for a fight. But there is a cost to that silence, and the cost is always paid by the person being humiliated and by any child who happens to be watching learn how the world treats her father. Julian felt all of it. He'd felt it on the tarmac at 19, that particular loneliness of being made small in a crowd of people who see it happen and decide it isn't theirs to stop. He knew that no one was coming to help him. He had made his whole peace with that a long time ago. He wasn't waiting to be rescued. He was simply holding his daughter and holding his temper and deciding second by second what kind of man his little girl was going to watch her father be. And here's what Julian Ford did. He did not tell Brooke that his name was on the side of the aircraft. He did not pull rank. He did not raise his voice because his daughter was asleep on his chest, and nothing in this world was going to make him raise his voice with Amara sleeping against his heart. He simply said very quietly, "My daughter's asleep. I paid for this seat, and I'm not going to move her. But you don't have to worry about me. I'm not going to be any trouble." And he looked back down at Amara, and he stroked her hair, and he made himself calm the way he had learned to do in hospital rooms, the way you learn to do when you have held someone you love while they left the world. But Brooke, who was young and proud and had an audience, took his calm as weakness, the way small people always mistake gentleness for something they can push. "Sir, I've asked you nicely. I don't want to have to get the purser involved. People who belong in this cabin don't usually need to be told twice." And there it was out loud in front of everyone, people who belong. Amara stirred. The noise had reached her, and she lifted her head from her father's chest, sleepy and confused, and she looked up at the flight attendant standing over them, and then at her father, and in the way children can read a room in an instant, her lip began to tremble. "Daddy," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" And I want you to sit with that for a second, because that question from a frightened 6-year-old was the moment this whole story turned. Julian Ford, who owned the airplane, who could have ended Brooke's career with a single sentence, felt his daughter's fear and his own anger rise up together hot, and for one instant he wanted to stand up and tell this young woman exactly who he was and watch her face fall. He is a human being. That instinct was real. But he looked down at Amara's frightened face, and he understood that whatever he did next, his daughter would remember it forever. And that mattered more than his pride, more than the airline, more than being right. So he pulled Amara close, and he said softly, so only she could hear, "No, baby, we're not in trouble. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people forget to be kind when they're scared or when they're trying to look important. That's not about us, okay? That's about them. You just watch how Daddy handles it, and you'll learn something. All right?" And Amara, reassured by the steadiness in his voice, nodded and nestled back against him, and Julian looked up at Brooke and said in that same low, even tone, "I'd like to speak to the captain, please. Not the purser. The captain." Brooke smirked, certain she'd won, certain she was about to have this nobody removed. "I'll go get the captain," she said. "Gladly." She went forward and knocked on the cockpit door. Now the captain of that aircraft was a woman named Captain Rivera, a 22-year veteran, one of the most senior pilots at Ford Air, and one of the few people in the company who had actually met its founder in person, because Julian made a point of knowing his senior captains. Brooke leaned into the cockpit and said with a little roll of her eyes, "Captain, sorry to bother you. I've got a passenger in 2A refusing to cooperate. Doesn't really seem like a first-class type. I think he snuck up from economy. Can you come back and—" Captain Rivera unbuckled, said a word to her first officer, and came back into the cabin to handle what she assumed would be a routine disturbance. And she stopped dead in the aisle beside seat 2A because she was looking at Julian Ford. The blood drained from her face, not from fear, but from the sheer vertiginous understanding of what was happening. She straightened up on instinct the way a soldier does, and she said in a voice that carried through the silent cabin, clear as a bell, "Mr. Ford." A beat. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were on this flight." The name landed on that first-class cabin like a thunderclap. Mr. Ford. And you could watch it move down the rows face by face as people put it together. The plain jacket, the old bag, the airline's name on the ticket, on the safety card on the wall. And Brooke, standing a few feet away, went the color of the clouds outside the window, because Captain Rivera turned to her and said the words that Brooke Halloran would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. "This is Julian Ford. He founded this airline. He owns the aircraft you're standing in." You could have heard a pin drop at 35,000 feet. Brooke's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled instantly with tears of pure horror. And every apology she'd refused to give, every ounce of the arrogance she'd performed for the cabin, came crashing back down onto her all at once. "I don't want to have to get the purser involved. People who belong in this cabin," every word replaying in her head as she stood there in front of the man who signed her paychecks and the daughter she'd frightened. And here's the whole reason I'm telling you this story. Because what Julian Ford did next is the thing that separates a powerful man from a good one. Captain Rivera, furious on his behalf, was already turning to Brooke, and she said, low and hard, "You are relieved. Go to the back, and when we land, you'll—" And Julian raised a hand, gently. "Captain, hold on." The whole cabin was watching. Brooke was shaking, waiting for the blow, waiting to be destroyed in front of all these people, exactly the way she'd tried to destroy the man in the wrinkled jacket. And Julian Ford unbuckled his seatbelt carefully so as not to disturb Amara, and he stood up in the aisle to his full height, and he looked at the terrified young woman in front of him. And then he said something that nobody expected. "What's your name?" he asked, not cruelly, quietly. Brooke," she managed. "Brooke Halloran, Mr. Ford. I have no words, Brooke," he said. "How long have you been flying with us?" "6 weeks, sir." Julian nodded slowly. 6 weeks. You know, when I was 19, I loaded bags onto airplanes for the company this became $8 an hour, freezing cold, and you know what I remember most about those 3 years? Brooke shook her head, tears running now. "I remember how it felt to be invisible, to watch people up in the warm cabin look straight through me like I wasn't a person, like I didn't matter, like the only people worth being kind to were the ones who could do something for you." He let that sit. "I built this entire airline around one rule, Brooke. One. There is no such thing as an unimportant person on my airline. Not the person in seat 2A, not the person in the last row of economy, not the man loading the bags in the cold. Nobody." His voice never rose. It didn't have to. "And you looked at a tired father and his sleeping little girl, and you decided we weren't important enough for kindness. You didn't do it because I'm the owner. You didn't know that. You did it because you thought we were nobody. And that, Brooke, how you treat the person you think is nobody, that's the only thing that actually tells me who you are." Brooke was crying openly now. I understand, and I'll accept whatever." "I'm not going to fire you," Julian said. The whole cabin seemed to exhale at once. Captain Rivera blinked. Brooke stared at him, uncomprehending. "I'm not going to fire you," he said again, "because getting fired would let you off easy. You'd get to go home and tell yourself a story where you were the victim, where the rich owner destroyed you over a misunderstanding. No, I want you to keep this job. And I want you every single shift to remember the face of that little girl when she woke up scared and asked her daddy if they were in trouble, because you did that, Brooke. And I want you to spend the rest of your career making sure no passenger of mine ever feels the way you just made a 6-year-old feel. That's your punishment, not losing the job, doing it right every day and remembering why. Can you do that?" And Brooke Halloran, 23 years old, looked at the man she had tried to throw out of his own aircraft, the man who was choosing in front of everyone to give her a future instead of taking one away. And she nodded and she whispered, "Yes, sir. I promise. I promise." "Good, Tut," Julian said, and then because he was who he was, he added more gently, "And for what it's worth, you clearly care about this cabin. You just pointed it at the wrong thing, pointed at kindness instead. You'll be one of the best we've got." And he sat back down, and he pulled his daughter close, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't quite the end, because Amara had watched the whole thing with her wide, dark eye, and as the cabin slowly returned to the ordinary sounds of a flight, the hum of the engines, the clink of the cart, the murmur of relieved conversation, she looked up at her father and whispered, "Daddy, the lady was crying. Is she okay?" And Julian looked down at his 6-year-old, who had every reason to be angry at the woman who'd frightened her, and who was instead worried about whether that woman was okay, and his heart nearly came apart in his chest. Because that right there was the whole thing he was trying to raise. A child who, when someone was unkind to her and then got caught, felt not triumph, but concern. "She's going to be okay, baby," Julian said softly. "She made a mistake and she felt bad about it, and feeling bad is how we learn to do better. She's going to be all right." "It was kind of you to ask." And Amara nodded satisfied and put her head back on his chest, and within a minute she was asleep again, and Julian sat there at 35,000 feet, holding his daughter and thinking that of everything that had just happened, the reveal. The captain. The whole cabin turning around, the single best moment had been a little girl asking if the woman who scared her was okay. That was worth more than the entire airline. That was the only thing that had ever been worth anything at all. And there is one more thing that happened on that flight that I have to tell you, because it's the part Julian cared about most. When it was all over, when Brooke had gone quietly to compose herself and the cabin had settled and the drinks cart had finally come around the older woman 2 rows back, the one who'd opened her mouth earlier and said nothing, got up and came forward and crouched by Julian's seat. She was crying a little. And she said, "Sir, I saw the whole thing and I didn't say a word, and I've been sitting back there ashamed of myself. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry I didn't." And Julian Ford looked at her with real gentleness, and he said something she never forgot. "Ma'am, don't carry that. You just did the brave thing. You came up here and owned it, which is more than most people ever do. The only thing any of us can do is be a little quicker to speak up next time. That's all. That's how it gets better. One person at a time deciding not to stay quiet." And that woman flew home, and the story goes became the kind of person who speaks up in restaurants, in stores, in meetings, anywhere. She saw someone being made small because a man she'd failed to defend had refused to shame her and had shown her the door to becoming better instead. The kindness rippled outward from seat 2A in ways Julian never even saw. That's how it works. You never know how far a single act of grace will travel. They tell that story at Ford Air to this day. And Brooke Halloran, I want you to know this is still with the airline years later. She's a senior purser now, and she trains new flight attendants. And on the first day, she tells every single one of them the same thing. There is no such thing as an unimportant person on this airline. Not one. She learned it from the man she almost threw off his own plane. Some lessons only stick when they cost you everything to learn them, and the mercy of the person who could have destroyed you and didn't is a debt you spend your whole life paying forward. But you know by now that this story was never really about Brooke or the airline or the reveal. It was about the little girl asleep in seat 2A. So let me take you home there. And here's the thing you have to understand about how Julian raised that little girl, because it explains everything about the man in seat 2A. Every night, no matter where in the world he was, no matter what was happening with the airline, Julian Ford was home for bedtime, or he was on a video call propped against the tray table of some hotel room, so he could read Amara her 3 stories through a screen. He had built a $10 billion company, and he had built it specifically so that it would bend around a 6-year-old's bedtime, because he had learned sitting by his wife's hospital bed for 11 months. The one lesson that most powerful people learn far too late, that no amount of anything can buy back a single evening you didn't spend with the people you love. Sophia had made him promise near the end in a whisper, "Don't disappear into that company. She needs her father more than the world needs another airline." And Julian had kept that promise like a sacred vow. So when a flight attendant tried to move him to the back of the plane, she was not just inconveniencing a passenger. She was trying to separate a grieving father from the sleeping daughter he had reorganized his entire empire to be near. She had no way of knowing that. But it's why his calm ran as deep as it did. He had already lost the one thing that could truly be taken from him. Everything after that was just noise. That night in her own bed under a mobile of little paper airplanes that Julian had hung for her Amara was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Daddy, that lady on the plane was mean to us. She was baby. But you weren't mean back, and you owned the whole airplane. You could have been really, really mean back." Julian sat on the edge of her bed and he smoothed the blanket and he said, "That's right, I could have." "Why didn't you?" And Julian Ford, who owned a fleet of aircraft and 10,000 employees, and a rule that there is no such thing as an unimportant person, looked at his 6-year-old daughter and he said the thing he most wanted her to carry for the rest of her life. Because Amara, having power over somebody is exactly when you find out what kind of person you really are. When you can't hurt somebody back, being kind is easy. It doesn't mean anything. But when you can hurt them, when you've got all the power and they've got none and everybody's watching and they deserve it, and you choose to be kind anyway. He touched the tip of her nose. That's the whole thing, baby. That's the entire game. That's the only kind of powerful that's worth being. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Your mama taught me that. And now I'm teaching you. And someday you're going to teach it to somebody too. Amara thought about that, her eyes already getting heavy. I'm going to be kind even when I could be mean, she murmured. That's my girl, Julian whispered. That's my whole heart right there. And he sat with his daughter until she fell asleep under her little paper airplanes, the way he did every night, the way he would for years to come, because in the end, all the aircraft and all the power in the world came down to one small promise made to one sleeping child, and it was the only thing he had ever built that he was truly proud of. There's one more small thing I want to tell you before I let you go, because it stayed with me. A few weeks after that flight, a plain envelope arrived at Brooke Halloran's apartment with no return address. Inside was a photograph, an old faded one of a skinny 19-year-old in a ramp cruise safety vest standing on a frozen tarmac at dawn squinting up at an airplane. And on the back, in Julian Ford's handwriting, were just a few words, "This was me before anyone thought I was anybody. Everyone you serve is somebody's whole world. Fly kind, JF." And Brooke Halloran framed that photograph, and she has carried it in her flight bag every single day of her career, since on every flight to every city for years. Because a man she tried to throw off his own airplane had chosen, instead of destroying her, to hand her the truth that would make her better for the rest of her life. That is what mercy does that punishment never can. Punishment ends a story. Mercy begins one. So let me leave you with this tonight, wherever you're listening from. The next time you have a little power over someone, a waiter, a clerk, a new employee, anyone the world has decided is beneath you, remember that exact moment when you could be unkind and get away with it is the moment that tells the whole truth about who you are. Anybody can be gracious to the people who can help them. It costs nothing. But how you treat the person who can do absolutely nothing for you when nobody's making you be kind, that's your real face. That's the one that counts. So make it a kind one, every single time. If this story reached something in you tonight, tell me down in the comments. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be? Have you ever watched someone use a little bit of power to make another person feel small? I read every single comment, all of them. Type altitude one more time so I know you stayed with me all the way to the end. And share this with someone who needs the reminder that real strength always, always looks like gentleness. Thank you for flying with me tonight, so to speak. Take good care of each other down there, and I'll see you in the next story.